Alright, so here we are once again with a finalized preset. The Simple Graphs preset has been applied, and you can see that it's creating this pie chart. And down at the bottom, you can see all of the different effects that are connected through expressions to make our control actually create something. And this is what we're going to be working on in this video. So this is where the real work happens, where we make our control drive the look of what's happening in our composition. Now, one thing I want to show you is that everything that we're doing is all happening on top of a single layer. Now, presets can actually contain effects as well as multiple layers. So if we wanted to, each slice of this pie graph could have been a separate solid layer, and we could have created it that way. But I feel like it's a little bit more clean if we can create everything on top of a single layer. However, to do this sort of thing, it's a little bit more complex. So before we get started with all the expressions, I want to show you just the concept of what we're going to be doing to make this all happen on top of just a single layer. So I'm going to go into a new composition, and we'll create a new solid, and it doesn't matter what color this is because it'll all be replaced. And we're going to go into Effects, Channel, and down to Solid Composite. Now what this does is basically creates another solid and places it on top of the solid we had there. So let's change the color from white to, let's just say red, and we'll change the source opacity down to 0. So now you can see the solid composite has taken place, and whatever color we have here is the color that's showing up back here. So for our pie chart, or any of our graphs, we want to be able to change the size of, let's say this is a single slice. And to do that, we're actually going to use one of the transition effects, and we're just going to use linear wipe, which is down here off your screen. And the transition completion is what's going to control the length of this slice. So for our next slice, we're actually just going to create another instance of solid composite, so I'll duplicate that and place it below our linear wipe. Now I'm going to change this color just so we can see it. And we'll also duplicate the linear wipe. And I'm going to change the second solid composite, the source opacity, from 0 all the way up to 100. Now right now it still looks like there's just a single slice here. That's because both of these transition completions are the same. However, if I decrease the transition completion, you can now see that second layer is coming through. So by continuing to duplicate this solid composite and the linear wipe, we can continue to create more and more slices of our graph. So we'll change this to say blue, and we'll lower the transition completion even more. And you can see now we have a third part of this graph. So this is how we're going to create all of our different slices on just a single layer. So I'm going to delete everything we have here. And so once again, I'll apply our control. Now I still have it open in the Extend Script Toolkit. Push play, and our control has been applied. And we're actually going to skip over all the global parameters for now. We'll go back to these once we have the base of our preset set up. And that's going to start with all of our slices. Now let's create our first slice, which is going to be done just the way I showed you before. So we'll go to, once again, to Effect, Channel, and down to Solid Composite. And for the first layer only, we're going to change our source opacity down to 0. So now all we see is this solid composite. Now let's open up the Slice 1 option. And let's start with a simple one, which is just to attach the color of this to the color in our control. So what we're going to do is hold down Alt and click on the stopwatch. And this is going to bring it up down in our timeline. So what we're going to do to make this easy is just take the pick whip and drag it up to our Slice 1 color control. So you can see it's now applied the Simple Graphs Slice 1 color down here in the expression. And if we hit the number pad enter key or just click out anywhere on here, you can now see that this color has been applied to that solid composite. And anything we change it to over here in our control is now changing the solid composite. So now our control is driving this effect. Now, unfortunately for us, it's not going to be this simple, because if we go into the global parameters section and into the look tab, you can see we have this option called random colors. And what that means is that our color is either going to be affected by our choice or a random color. So it's not going to be as simple as just this one-line expression. We're going to have to create an if statement. Now, unfortunately, the interface for creating expressions in After Effects isn't that great, so I'm actually going to go back into the Notepad++, and I'll just create a blank file, and this will make it a little bit easier for you to see what we're doing in After Effects. Now, the downside to working in a separate text editor is that you don't have this option to pick whip. But what we can do is use the pick whip and just copy and paste straight from here, and then once we're done in Notepad, we can paste it back into After Effects. Now, I don't always work this way, but in the case of tutorials, I only have a small screen space to use, so when I'm working on my own, I expand this expression area to larger size to make it easier to work. But for this tutorial, I'll be working in Notepad and then pasting everything into After Effects. So let's create this expression. So the if is going to depend on whether or not the random colors checkbox is on or off. So let's start with our if statement, which is if, and let me change the language to JavaScript just so we get some color coding. So if, opening and closing parentheses, and in here we're going to say effect, and then in quotes, simple graphs. And this is referring to this control, our custom control. And then next to this, we're going to create another set of parentheses, another set of quotations, and type in random colors. And so now this is referring to our random colors control. Now we also could have gotten the same thing by coming in here and pick whipping the random colors control. And you can see here, it's given us the same thing that we just typed in Notepad. So what you can do is, if you like to work in a separate text editor, and you can see it gave us an error here because we clicked out, and this expression doesn't work for this control. So what it's telling us is that it's disabled. You'll get this a lot when you're working in this, when you're going in and out of different expressions. It's just letting you know that the expression's been disabled. So we can copy this, and rather than typing it by hand, we can just paste it in here. But you can see it gave us the exact same thing. Now, we want to get the value of this control. We want to know if it's checked or not checked. And to get that value, you type .value. So this will either return true or false. Now, with if statements, you can actually just leave it at this. And if it's true, which is what this will return, then it'll do the first thing. If it's false, which is another option for what this .value will return, it'll do something else. But just to make it extremely explicit for After Effects, I'm actually going to say straight out, is it equal to true? So you can see that I used the double equal sign, which is saying, is one thing equal to another? If it was just a single equal sign, it would seem like we're trying to assign true to the value, which is not what we want to do. We want to compare, which is why we use the double equal sign. Then we're going to use an opening and closing curly brace. And if this is true, which means that the random colors checkbox is checked, then let's generate a random color. Now, to get the random color, what we're going to do is we're going to create a random value for the red, green, and blue channel. So let's create 3 variables real quick. Now, in standard JavaScript, before each variable name, you would actually type var to say that the next word, which in our case is going to be red, is a variable. But with the way that After Effects works, you actually don't need to put in that var, so we'll just leave it out, but you can use it if you'd like. So I'm going to say is equal to random, and then I'm going to type in 255. So what this is saying to do is choose a number between 0 and 255. Now, this will return any number between 0 and 255, which means we could get any random decimal value. But we want to get only whole numbers because that's all we want for our color values. So we're actually going to round this. And to round a number, we're going to use one of the built-in math functions, and this is actually in JavaScript as well. So if you know JavaScript, you'll know this. So you're going to type in capital M math.round, and we'll enclose the random function in parentheses. So what this is saying is to generate a random number between 0 and 255, and then round it to the nearest whole number. And it's going to round just as you would round a number. So if it's 0.4 or below, it's going to round down, and if it's 0.5 or above, it's going to round up. So Now, this function will assign red to a whole number value between 0 and 255. And we're going to actually just copy and paste this 2 more times to get our green and our blue values. And then to apply this color, what we do is we create an opening and closing square brace. And what this is creating an array. And in After Effects, what the color value is going to expect is an array that has 4 keys. It's going to be a red, a green, a blue, and an alpha channel. And all of these values have to be between 0 and 1. Now, in our expression right now, all of these values are between 0 and 255. So to get the values between 0 and 1, we're going to have to divide our values by 255. So the end of this expression is going to be red divided by 255, green divided by 255, and blue divided by 255. And then our alpha value is just going to be 1, which means that it's going to be completely opaque. 0 would be transparent, 1 is opaque. And if you'd like, for your pie chart, you can add another random and make the alpha random as well. But for me, I always want our chart to be completely visible. And we can control the opacity using another method. So what we have here now is if this random colors option is checked, which means that it's true, it's going to create a random value. Now, one issue that we have here is that random values in After Effects, if the layer index is the same, the random values that are generated are also always going to be the same. To change the random values that are generated, we actually use a random seed property, which is why we have this option in our control. So to apply that random seed to our random numbers, we have to actually precede what we've written here with the seed random function. Now the seed random function is expecting 2 parameters, the first of which is the number. And we're going to use the random seed number over in our control to drive the seed random function. So let's go back into After Effects and we'll pick whip the random seed control. And we'll copy this and paste it into the first parameter. Then we'll say comma. And the second parameter will be true. Now, the second parameter in seed random is basically saying, do we want this seed to be persistent? If this was set to false, because expressions recalculate every frame, the seed random would also recalculate every frame, which means that every single frame of our composition would have a different color. By setting this to true, we're saying that we want it to generate a random value at the first frame, and then every frame after that uses that same random value, which basically makes it a random value that can then be maintained through our whole composition. So that's it for one half of our if statement. The other half is what we had created earlier, which is simply to use the slice one color. So let's pick whip this slice one color. We'll copy this in, and we'll paste this into the second half of our if statement. And it's a good practice to get into to end all your lines with a semicolon, especially in After Effects expressions because it's not the best setup. So now we can take this whole expression, copy it, and paste it right into After Effects. And you can see when we enter out, we don't get any errors. And now, if we check this random colors box, you can see that it changes from the slice one color to just a random pink color. And if we change the random seed, you can see that with every new number, it creates a new random color. But as I scroll along, that color stays consistent throughout our entire composition. So it's taken a little bit of time, but now we've created our first expression for our control. Now all we have to do is copy and paste this into the other solid composites that we haven't created yet. Now unfortunately we can't just copy and paste this directly. We actually have to change one value, which is the slice 1 color is going to have to be changed to slice 2 color, slice 3 color, and so on. So we're going to have to change that with each separate expression. But first, let's create the rest of our solid composite effects. Now, before we get too far ahead, we want to name all of our different layers so that 1, we can tell them apart from each other, and 2, so that we can label them as being part of the Simple Graphs preset. Now, when the user applies your preset to their layer, they're going to see not only the control, but also all of the different effects that are used to make your control happen. So what we want to do is put in some sort of prefix or label these layers somehow so that your user knows that this effect is being used for this control. So what I like to do is just precede the name with just an abbreviation of the preset. So I'm going to type in SG for simple graphs, and then we'll type in slice 1 color, because that's what this layer is being used for. We could also say something like slice 1A, because there's a slice 1A and there's a slice 1B when we use the transition completion. So we'll leave it at that. And now I'm going to create 9 more duplicates for each of our different slices. So Control D. And now we have all of them. So let's first change these names. Slice 2A. Okay, so now we have a separate solid composite layer for each of our different slices. And you can see that right now they all have their own random colors. Now, it might appear as though all these expressions are already working, and sort of they are, but like I said, we have to change this number from 1 to whatever slice we're referring to. So right now, if we turned off the random colors, you can see that all of our slices' colors are being controlled by the same slice 1 color attribute. So let's go into each of these different controls and change it so that they're all referring to their own slice color. So what I can do to bring up all the expressions quickly, and let's give us some more room here, is click on our layer and just hit the E key twice. And now that brings up all of our expressions. So we'll go into each of our different slices and change it from 1 to whichever slice we're working on. So in this case it's 2, 3, 10. Okay, so let's shrink this back down. And now if we go through, you can see that each of our different layers is being controlled by a separate color control inside of our custom control. So if we change slice 2 color from orange to green, you can see that down here in the slice 2, we now have that same green. It's no longer connected to anything else. And if we turn on random colors, you can see that everything is randomized. So everything right now is working just as we want it to. So let's turn random colors back off, and let's get to work on the next part, which is to make the transitions all work to create our graph. Now, this part is where it gets a little bit more complicated. Let's start with just our first slice. So let's close everything up. And we're just going to worry about slice 1. So let's create that first linear wipe effect, transition, and linear wipe, which is down here off your screen. And we're going to drag this between slice 1A and slice 2A. Now let's actually first just rename this to SG, just like all the rest, and slice 1B, because this is the second half of our first slice. Now right now, our transition completion is at 0%, and you can see that as I increase it, nothing's actually happening. And that's because of one of the options that we set inside our first solid composite. And if you remember, we changed the source opacity down to 0%. But we actually want the rest of our solid composites to be 100%. So let's go through and change that real quick. And now you can see that we're down to just our first slice. And now if we increase the transition completion, you can see that it's revealing our second slice as we increase the slice 1B transition. And just because these colors are fairly similar, let's change the second one to a blue. Okay, so now we can see the difference between our two slices. Alright, so let's start to write the expression for this transition completion. Now this is another one of those expressions that's going to start out simple and it's going to slowly get more complex, but we are going to start by just attaching the percentage to our slice 1 amount. So let's go to our slice 1B, transition completion. We'll alt click on this, and we're going to go up and pick whip the slice 1 amount. Okay, so now you can see that the slice 1 amount in our control now controls the transition completion. Now the problem is that when we set this to 100, you can see our layer is completely gone. And when we set it to 0, it's at 100%. So we actually have to change this to 100 minus the amount. And that way when it's at 0, there's nothing from our layer scene. And when we increase it, the size of the slice increases. So now this would be fine if all we wanted to do was be able to set the value explicitly. And that would work. But we actually have two different methods for setting the size of the layers. In the first method, the graph is locked to a total of 100%, which means that the value of each slice is going to represent its percentage of the graph, which is what we have it set to right now. We're setting the values explicitly, which means that a value of, say, 10 means that it will take up 10% of the chart. Now the problem with this method is that if the slices add up to greater than 100%, because the user can put in whatever values they want, that means that some of the values are going to end up being cut off. Now we have this option called calculate percentages, which what that does is tells our expression to add up all of the slice amounts and then find a new total based on the percentages that we've set. This way, no matter what values we set for the slice amounts, the graph is always going to be complete and we're never going to cut off any values. So to work on this expression, let's go back into our text editor. And let's get rid of this old expression and we'll start with our new expression. So we have that half. Now let's create our if statement, which is going to be similar to our previous if statement. So if, and then we want to know if the calculate percentages checkbox is checked. So we'll copy this. And so if that's checked, then we're going to do something. Otherwise, we're going to do this expression which we just set up. So first, let's create a variable for each of the different slice amounts, and then we can calculate the total of all of those slices. So our variable names are just going to be 1, 2, 3, all written out. So we'll start with 1, and let's get the slice amount. So now we have a variable 1 set to the simple graph's slice 1 amount. And we can actually just duplicate this 9 more times, and then we can use the same thing for all of our other numbers. And then all we have to do is change the numbers over here to match the variable. So now we have all of our variables, and all of these will contain the number set in our slice amount. So to get the total, we're going to create a new variable called total, and this is going to be equal to 1 plus 2, and so on. So now our total is going to be the total value when we add up all of these different variables. And then to get our percentage, we're going to create another variable called final value. And this is going to be equal to 1, which is the current expression we're working on is for slice 1. And we're going to divide that by the total. So this value is going to be the percentage of the total for our number 1 value, our slice 1 value. What percent is it taking up? The problem right now is that this is going to give us a value between 0 and 1. We actually want this to be a value between 0 and 100. So we're going to put this value in parentheses, and we're going to multiply by 100. And then because of that same issue we had earlier, where we had to create the 100 minus, we're going to have to do the same thing up here. So 100 minus this value. And now we've got our two different expressions. Now, just to make this a little bit more clear for After Effects, we're going to also set the second part of this if statement equal to the same variable final value. So now if we go to the first part, final value equals this. The second part, final value will equal this. and then we're going to go outside of our if statement and just type final value. So now no matter which way we go in this if statement, we're still going to create the final value variable. It's just going to be different depending on whether or not that calculate percentages option is checked or not. But either way, it's going to end by stating we want to set it to the final value variable. So let's copy all this. And we'll go back into our slice 1b transition completion. And we'll hit paste. So now you can see that as we go up, because this is unchecked, our values are being set explicitly. So a value of 50 is going to be 50% of the composition. If we turn on calculate percentages, you can see that's changed. So if we change it to 25, now all 4 of our values, you can see that the rest are set to 0. So all 4 of the shown values are 25, which means that each slice is going to be 25% of the composition. So you can see that this green slice takes up 25%. Now, if we change this to say 75, you can see now it's taking up 50%. And the reason for that is that slice 1 is 75. And if we add up the other 3 slices that have values, those also add up to 75. So the slice 1 has 50% of the value for all of these slices. If we add in another slice, so change slice 5 to 25%, you can see it affects the percentage that the slice 1 amount is taking up. Change that back to 0. So now we just have to apply this expression to all of our other controls. And let's go down here and let's create all of our slice Bs. So duplicate this. So we have 10 of them. And then we'll just drag them all below their corresponding section. And then we'll rename them all. Alright, so now we have all of these different slices, and you can see that they all have pink values, which means they already have the expression applied to them. Now, unfortunately, those expressions will only apply to the first layer, so the ones on all the layers except for the first one are incorrect right now, so we're going to have to make a couple of changes. Now, for the most part, there's 2 changes that we have to make. One is just like before, where we have to change the one variable and the number down here to the corresponding number. For instance, for the second slice, we need to change it to 2 and the number 2 here. But we also need to change the leading 100 values that are over here. Now, let me show you the reason for that. If we go back into After Effects, you can see that currently all of these slice values are set to 50%. And yet the only one that we see up here is that first slice. The only one that we see is the green one. Now, why is that? Well, it's because all of these linear wipes are all stacking on top of each other. And since they're all set to 50%, the only one we're seeing is the top one. So for instance, if I go down here and I turn off the slice 1, you can see that now a different layer shows through. Let's turn off all of these slices except for the top 2, just to make this a little bit easier to understand. Now, right now we have slice 1 and slice 2 turned on, and both of their transition completions are set to 50%. However, let's go into the slice 2, go up here, and let's turn off this expression so that we can set it manually. Now, right now it's set to 50%, so you'd expect that we see half of this composition also be the slice 2 color. But right now all we're seeing is the slice 1, and that's because since both of these are set to 50%, they're both taking up the same space. As we decrease this, now we're starting to see that second slice peek out because we're now seeing what's not being covered up by the first slice. So basically our problem is that these values aren't adding together. Now, what we're going to do to fix that is rather than start with 100 and subtract from there, we want to subtract from the previous value. So for instance, slice 1, yes, we're starting with 100. But slice 2, we want to start with whatever the slice 1 value is. So let's get that value. Let's go into the slice 2, and we'll delete the expression that's there so far, and let's pick whip the transition completion for slice 1. So we can copy this, and replace both of our 100 values. And now, when we calculate our slice 2, rather than starting with 100, like I said, it's going to start with the value for the previous slice. Now, we also need to change this one to 2, and this one to 2. So now this will be the correct expression for our second slice. So we can paste this in here. And now you can see that we're getting 50% of slice 1, which is what's set here. And then to that, we're adding another 25% for slice 2. And you can see that the 25% is being added on rather than being set and covered up by that first slice. So if we go back up to our controls and bring down the slice 2 amount and set this up to say 50, now you can see that 50% of the composition is slice 1 and 50% of the composition is slice 2. And if we set these down, let's say we set slice 1 down to 10% rather than 50%, you can see how that second slice moved along with it. The second slice isn't resizing, it's not changing anything, it's just sliding along with that first slice. So now we have to go through and change 4 values for each of the different expressions. We need to change the numbers, and then we need to change the slice numbers to the previous slice. So for instance, for 2, we're looking at slice 1. For 3, we're going to be looking at slice 2. So each layer is going to be looking at the slice that came before it. So let's go through and change all of those. Okay, so now all of our slices have the correct expressions on them. So let's go and turn these back on. And you can see those other layers now are showing through. And if we go into our control, let's change some of these values just so we can see more of our slices. So let's change all of them to 10%. So you can see that we have 10 separate slices and each one of them is taking up a tenth of our composition. Now, to give you an example of what the calculate percentages checkbox is doing, which we wrote over here, is you can see that with this unchecked, if we go through and we change the slice 1 percentage from 10 up to 20, you can see that that slice 1 is now double its size, but it also pushed that last slice right out of the composition. You can see that if we bring this down just a little bit, you can see now part of this blue slice, this light blue slice, which is number 10, is coming back in. But you can see that slice 10 is still set to 10%, but that's definitely not 10% that's showing through. And the reason for that is because these values that we've set here are adding up to 106, so there's more than 100% to be seen. Now, the calculate percentages, it fixes this by creating a new total and basing the percentages off of that new total. So now you can see when I click that, none of these layers are being cut off. You can see that all of these slices, except for the first, are the same size. And each of them is now being showed for their correct percentage of the total value when we add all of these different slices together. Now, let's say we change the slice 1 amount to 100 just by itself. Well, now you can see that all of these other layers have resized because that slice 1 is now worth a greater percentage of the total amount. So let's just simplify this a little bit and let's go back to our 4 slices with 25 set for each of them. Okay, so right now you can see that this doesn't really look like a pie chart. It's more of the bar graph that I showed you earlier. So we're actually going to be working with this a little bit later, but just to show you what I'm going to do, let's go into Effect, to Distort, and it's off the screen, but it's called Polar Coordinates. Now you might have used this in the past, and you probably have, but if we change polar coordinates, this type of conversion, from what it's set to rect to polar, and then change the interpolation up to 100%, you can see that now we've got this pie chart shape. So that's how we're going to convert our bar graph into a pie chart. And this is going to be helpful for when we look at the next couple sections, so I'll be turning this on and off. But I'm not going to work with it too much other than that for right now. Now, let's start by adding our gradient. So let's close all of these other effects. And we'll open back up Simple Graphs, and we're going to go into the Look section. So you can see here at the bottom we have this checkbox for the gradient. Now, to create our gradient, all we're going to do is add a ramp on top of all of our layers. So let's go to Effect, Generate, and down to Gradient Ramp. We're not going to worry about any blending modes. All we're going to do is change the blend with original amount to 50% when we want the gradient to be applied, and all the way up to 100% when it's not applied. So you can see that when it's 100%, it's completely blended with the original, which means that only the original layer is seen. And 50%, since it's just black and white, it gives us that gradient look. So that's all that our expression is going to be for this, is we're going to set it so if the gradient box is unchecked, we're going to turn this to 100%. And if it is checked, we want to see the gradient, and we're going to change it to 50%. So let's create that expression. Alt-click on the Blend with Original stopwatch. And we're going to say if, and we'll pick whip up at the top, our gradient, Control. And then let's copy this into the notepad just to make it easier to work with. So open and closing braces, and then we'll just give ourselves some space. And this is actually an extremely simple expression. So basically, if this checkbox is checked, in which case it will give us a value of true. So if the checkbox is checked, then we want to set that value to 50. And to do that, all we have to do is write 50, and it will use that value. Otherwise, or else, we want the value to be 100. So that's our whole expression right there. So we can copy this and paste it right into our Blend with Original expression. And if we scroll up and we check this box now, you can see that when it's checked, we see that gradient, and when it's unchecked, it's completely gone. So that was a nice, easy expression for the gradient. So let's move on, and let's work with the border. That's one of our largest sections of this control. Now, the way we're going to create the border is actually a little bit complicated. What we're going to do is use the checkerboard effect. Actually, before we get too far, let's rename this gradient ramp. We'll change this to SG gradient, just to keep it in line with the rest of our naming conventions, and we'll drag it above the polar coordinates effect. And now we can go in to Generate and Checkerboard. Okay, so we've applied our checkerboard effect, and let's start by renaming it, just to match everything else. So SG, and we're going to call this border. Now you can see that right now, this doesn't look anything like a border, but we're going to change some settings, and you'll see where we're getting to. So let's start by changing the size from width slider to width and height sliders, and that will allow us to separate the two controls so that we can control the width and the height separately. So we're going to turn this up to the width of our composition now, which, since I'm working in HD 1080, the width is 1920. And we'll just increase the height to a random number for now. So you can see that we still have this checkerboard with just 4 sections, and we're actually going to drag the anchor all the way over to the right side. Now you can see that we have a little bit of a border on the left, so let's just increase this from 1920 to 2000, and that'll give us a little bit of padding to play with. Now you can see that right now we have a white section and a black section, but if we go down here and we change the blending mode from none to normal, you can see that that black area goes away and it reveals the section below it. Now if we right now turned on polar coordinates, you can see that we get this dot in the middle. So let's turn that back off, and let's drag our anchor point from where it is above the layer, and then we'll increase the height until this white section is only visible just at the bottom. And now when we turn on this polar coordinates, you can see that now we have this border around our pie chart. And by changing the height value, we're changing how large that border is. Now, we're actually going to have to come back and do a lot of playing around with this border and the checkerboard effect. But for now, I'm just going to worry about how the pie chart looks. We're not going to worry about the graph or the ring chart. So we'll be coming back and changing some of the expressions, adding expressions to a lot of these controls. But for now, I'm just going to worry about this pie chart, and we'll start to create some settings for that. One of the things we did when we started was we changed this width value to 2000. Now, it works for this composition because I'm using an HD 1080 comp, but what if whoever ends up using this has a composition that's greater than that value? Well, then this number is no longer going to work. So what we want to do is always have the width value be greater than the width of our composition. So to do that, let's just Alt-click on here. And we're going to write W for width is equal to this layer. So this layer is always referring to the layer to which the effect is applied. Dot width. So the layer's width, and then we're going to add 100 to give us that same sort of padding as we did earlier. So we set this variable W equal to this number, and then we just want to tell After Effects to use this variable. So all we have to do is hit enter and type W. And now it's going to use that variable. So you can see it's gone from 1920 to 2020. It's added that extra 100, and that's our new width. And you can see that it's still working for us up here. Now, we also want to be able to keep the anchor point set into the correct place. So let's go write an expression for that. And let's go back to writing our expressions in the notepad just so it's a little bit easier to work with. And for the anchor point, you can see that it's just been placed kind of randomly up here. But let's find a specific spot so that we can write our expression so it's always in the correct place no matter what the size of the composition is. So let's start by creating a variable A for anchor point. And anchor point's expecting an array with at least 2 different variables. In this case, it's only 2 because we have just an X and a Y. So that's what we're going to give it. So to create an array, as I said before, we use the 2 square braces. And right now you can see that our anchor point is set to just over the width of our composition. Now, since we gave ourselves exactly 100 extra pixels to work with, let's split that in half and give each side 50 pixels around the side. So 1920 would be exactly, an extra 50 is going to be 1970. So we want to give each side an extra 50 pixels. You can see that we move that anchor point. So let's in here write this layer dot width plus 50. So it's going to take whatever the width of our layer is and add 50 pixels to put our anchor point 50 pixels to the right of our composition. So that's our X value. And then for our Y value, we can just keep it exactly at the top of our composition. So this can just be 0. And just to give ourselves a little bit of padding as we did before, just to make sure that the effect, which it sometimes does, peek through on that top pixel, we'll give it a negative value by just a little bit. It's set to negative 14 right now, but I think we can just go with something like negative 5, just to give it a little bit of space. So we'll say negative 5. And so now, whenever this effect is applied, it's always going to put it 50 pixels off to the right and 5 pixels above. And then we'll just be able to change the height value to affect the size of this border. So you can see that now, you can just change that height value, and it gives us a different border height. So let's copy this in. And we're going to Alt-click again and paste it right into the anchor point. And you can see that nothing's changed, but now these values are being set by the expression. If we try to change them, you can see that it won't let us because these values are explicitly set by our expression. Now the next thing we're going to look at is the border width. Now let's actually start to use some of these controls up here. The first of which is going to be use border. Now what we can use in our border control, which is our checkbox, is this opacity. So if we want to use the border, we'll turn the opacity to 100. And if we don't want to use the border, if it's unchecked, then we'll change the opacity to 0. So let's write that expression. Let's all click here, just so we can pick whip our control up here, use border. And we'll copy this in. So we can delete this one if use border dot value equals true, just as we've been doing. So if it's checked, the opacity is going to be 100. And if it's not checked, the opacity is going to be 0. So we can copy this and paste it into that opacity expression. So you can see right now it's set to 0. If we turn on use border, you can see it appears and the opacity is set to 100%. Now there's actually another part of this, which is the border opacity control. So you can see right now it's set to 100%, but if we turn this down, it's currently not affecting our opacity. So let's add that into our expression. We'll delete here and we'll pick whip to get our border opacity control. We can copy that. And we're going to paste it into the top half of our if statement. What we have here is we're saying if it's true, what we want it to do is use that border opacity. And if it's false, we still want it to be set to 0. So the border is either going to be 0 if it's turned off, or we want the opacity to be whatever our opacity is set to if it's on. So let's get rid of this 100. And instead just say the border opacities value. And simple as that, let's copy this back in, paste it to that opacity. And now you can see if the check is off, the border's gone. And if the check is on, you can see that the border's opacity is being set to whatever we have this control set to. So at 100, you can see it's completely opaque. At 0, it's basically like it's turned off. And anything in between, it's matching the opacity that we have set in our control. So now we've just taken care of 2 of these controls. Now let's work on the color, which is very easy because the checkerboard allows us to set the color of our boxes. So let's just alt-click on color, and we'll simply just pick whip the border color option. And as simple as that, we are able to set the color of our border. So there's another real simple one. Now the border width is going to be a little bit different. I'm not going to have 50 make the border be 50% of the way across. I'm going to find what I feel is a nice midway point. So let's do that real quick by changing the height value. And let's say that this is probably as big as the border should be. Completely gone would be as small as the border should be. And halfway is maybe around here. So when the border width control is set to 50%, this is how big I want the border to be. Now right now I'm at 974. Let's make it 975. Just because I feel like that's a little bit easier of a number to work with. Although it doesn't really matter. And so 975 is going to be our halfway point. Now, when it's set to 0, we're actually going to have to increase our height, which decreases the size of the border. So it's a little bit backwards to think about. And because we have our anchor point of the checkerboard set 5 pixels above, to get this completely out, we're going to have to set it to 1085 because the height of the composition is 1080, 1920 by 1080. And because this is 5 pixels up, we're going to have to add an extra 5. So you can see that when I set it to 1085, it's now completely gone. So basically, let me just try to write this out. When our control over here, when our border width is set to 50, we want our height to be set to 975. And when our border width is set to 0, we want our height to be set to 1085. If we subtract 975 from 1085, we get 110. So basically the difference in our height is going to be 110 pixels when we go from 0 to 50, which means that for when we have our border width set to 100, our height value is going to be set to 865. So what we're going to do is use 865 as our base value. And when the control is set to 0, it'll be 1085, and then everything else in between should match up. So let's start to write our expression right below here, and we'll keep this up here as a reference. So the expression is going to go onto our height, and let's just pick whip this border width control. So we're going to start with our base value, and we'll just write base is equal to 865. Then let's paste in our control, and then let's think about this. The difference between 50 and 0, their values, was 110. Which means the difference between 865 and 1085 is 220. So we have 220 pixels that we're going to convert into a value between 0 and 100. So to get the step size of 1% for our control, we have to divide 220 by 100. And what that will give us is each step of 1 for our control is going to be equal to 2.2 pixels. What also makes it confusing is that our higher border width is actually a lower height. So we're going to have to start like we did in another example. We're going to have to start by subtracting our value from 100. So here's our value, and let's set this equal to a variable just so it's easier to work with. We'll say control amount. And then we'll convert this. So we'll take 100 minus our control's value, and let's type in dot value. So 100 minus our control's value will be our control amount. And then because each percentage is worth 2.2, we'll take this control amount and we'll multiply by 2.2. And we'll set this value equal to another variable, which we're going to call add height, because this is the variable that's going to be added to our base height. And then what we want to output is our base plus our add height. And this value will give us what we want. So let's copy this expression and paste it into our height. And you can see that we now have our value of 975, and it's pink because it's being set by an expression. So right now our border width is at 50%, and we have that 975 value that we were aiming for. If we set this to 0, you can see that our border goes away, and our height's now set to 1085. If we set this border width to 100, which is the full width of what we want our border to be, the maximum we want our border to be, you can see that it's now at 865, which are the 3 values that we set up over here. So this is just an example of what I was going for. I just wanted to show you the way that you have to think when you're writing these sort of expressions and how you can control what your users will be able to set. We've now limited our control to only go to the border widths that we like. And if we turn on the polar coordinates again, we can see what it looks like in a pie chart. All our controls are completely interactive. You can change the colors. You can change the opacity. All we have left now is the blending mode option. Now this is actually a fairly simple option to work with. The only thing that makes it a little bit weird is that here we are only giving the user 4 options: normal, overlay, screen, and multiply. But if we scroll down and go into our border, and this is our checkerboard effect, you can see that their blending mode gives them a whole bunch of different choices, the usual ones that you'd see in After Effects or Photoshop. So what we want to do is be able to pick and choose the ones that we're working with. And the way we're going to write this expression is using a switch case statement. So let's start by turning on the expression for our blending mode, and this is within our border, our checkerboard effect. So we'll turn that on, and we'll do the usual and pick whip our border blend mode control. So let's go into the notepad and write this switch case statement. To start a switch case statement, you write switch, and then opening and closing parentheses. And this is where you write the value or the variable that could be changing, which in our case is going to be our control. So write dot value, and this value is going to be an index, and the index is either going to be 1, 2, 3, or 4. So each of our different selections has an index counting from 1 to 4. So then after the parentheses, we're going to make those opening and closing curly braces just like for an if statement. And inside, we're going to write down all of the different cases, all the different possibilities for this value. So we'll start with case of 1. And this is saying that if this value is 1, do the following. And what we're going to write as the output here is what we want to set our checkerboard's index to, depending on the index of ours. So for us, our first option is normal. So for us, an index of 1, we want to set to an index of 2 on this control, because you can see that normal on this side is the second option. So when we have our index 1 selected, we want to output an index of 2. And that's how simple this is going to be. And then we have to just follow this with the keyword break. And what break allows us to do is once it follows case 1, so case 1's true, we set the value to 2, we want to break out. We don't want to continue to go through the next cases because we've already found what ours is. So by writing the break, it's going to skip the rest of the expression and just keep this 2. So case 2, which in our case is overlay, we want to set the index to whatever this number is down here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then we actually have to add in the separator line as part of that index. So it's actually an index of 8. So in case ours is 2, we want to output 8. And then once again, we'll add that break. So now we have case 3, which for us is screen. And in the option down here, you can see screen is right above overlay, which means that it has an index of 7. And then finally we have case 4. And keep in mind that these, after the cases, these symbols are not semicolons like we use to break a line. they're actually colons. So when you're in a switch case statement, follow the cases with colons, not semicolons. So case 4, which in our control is multiply. Down here, it's 1 above screen, which would make it 6. So you can see that our order is a little bit backwards compared to what normally the blending modes are set to, but that's okay. Everything will still work. And even though this is the last one, we're still going to put break just to get in the habit of it. You don't actually have to write break after the last statement. Now, traditionally, switch case statements always end with a default statement, which basically is saying if this switch does not give the value 1, 2, 3, or 4, if it didn't match any of the cases, then do this. But since it's always going to be one of these 4 cases, we don't actually need to put in this default statement. So we'll leave that out here. We'll copy all this, and we'll paste it into that blending mode option. So now we have normal, which is that basic overlaid effect, which only looks transparent because we have our border opacity set down. Let's change this back up to 100. And let's also change the color just so we can see some of these effects better. So normal, you can see the border is just laid on top. Overlay, you can see it kind of blends with those layers. And if we look down here, the expression's working because you can see that the blend mode has also been set to overlay here. Screen, you can see it changes everything there. And multiply. So we can see that all of these border controls are now working correctly. And we can even add in that gradient, and you can see how everything's now mixed together. So I believe that we actually have now worked with all of our controls that we made except for the graph type control. And this is the one that's going to control the shape. As I mentioned earlier, we're currently using the polar coordinates to create this pie shape. But just to work with it, I'm going to turn off all these other look controls that we've been working with. And we'll close up all the slices. So now let's take a look at this graph type control, which is our first control, but it's also the only one that we haven't worked with yet. Now, in this control, we have 3 different choices: pie graph, bar graph, and ring graph. Now, what we have here currently is a pie graph shape. The ring graph is very similar to the pie graph, but it has the center section cut out of it, so all we see is a border ring. And then the bar graph is similar to what we have without the polar coordinates effect turned on, which is just a row of these bars pushed together. Since polar coordinates are already here, let's work with that first. And the pie graph and the ring graph options should have polar coordinates turned on, and the bar graph should have polar coordinates turned off. So the way we're going to do that is by setting the interpolation amount. If we want it turned on, we want it set to 100%. If we want it turned off, we want it set to 0. And that's basically like turning this effect on and off. So let's alt-click and go into its expression. And we'll then pick whip the graph type. Now let's copy this and go into our text editor. And we'll start with our usual if statement. Now the difference here is that we're not saying is this true or is it false. We want to know if it is a value of 1, so an index of 1, which is pie graph, or an index of 3, which is ring graph. And you can see that right now, our expression's already affecting it just because of the index value. You can see how that's changing it by setting it to either 1 down here, 2, or 3. So you can see how those index values are affecting our expression. So basically what we wanted to say is if the value is 1 or 3, then set it to 100. Otherwise, set it to 0. Now, we can still do that using an if statement, but we're going to make this a complex if statement by adding an or within that. So let's first set a variable equal to this just so it's easier to work with. So we'll write SEL for selection, and it'll be equal to that value. So we're going to say if SEL is equal to 1, then we want us to do this. And we want to write or. Now, to write or in an expression or in JavaScript, it's going to be 2 vertical lines. Now, if you haven't used the vertical line before, you push shift and then backslash. And the backslash is the one that's above the enter key. So shift backslash, and you're going to do that twice, and you get this vertical line. So now we're saying if the value is equal to 1 or if the value is equal to 3. So if it meets either of these two options, then it's going to return true. In which case we want to set polar coordinates to 100%. Otherwise, which in our case, otherwise would be if the value is equal to 2, then we want to set polar coordinates equal to 0. So that's our expression. And we'll put this in. And so now you can see that it's set to pi graph, which is an index of 2, and our expression set this value to 100%. If we go to bar graph, it's going to set this value back to 0%. And then for ring graph, you can see it's set it once again to 100%. So this is exactly what we want it to do. Now let's actually skip over the bar graph for now, and let's work with the ring graph a little bit. And you can see right now that we have just a pi graph, which is not what we want to end up with. So let's turn off polar coordinates for now, and we can actually change the name of this to match everything else. So SG, and we'll just call this pi. But we'll keep this off for now so we can work with this ring. So the way we're going to create the ring is by using another instance of the linear wipe to take away most of the slices. So let's go in here, Effect, Transition, and down to Linear Wipe. And you can see that as we increase this value, it's kind of going the wrong direction right now. So we're going to set it from 90 to 180. And now we can see that it's coming down from the top rather than from the side. And if we turn back on the pi, you can see that right now it's not doing anything, and that's because our linear wipe is happening after the pi. So we want to drag this up, and we're actually going to put it above the border control as well. But now you can see that rather than that pi shape, which we have if we turn off linear wipe, we're now getting the ring shape that we want. Now there's still a couple of issues with this linear wipe. If we go up here and we go into the look section and we turn on the gradient, you can see that this gradient isn't really applying correctly for what we would want for the ring. And there's the same sort of issue for the border. You can see even if we turn this down to say 10%, let's turn this to normal so we can see it a little bit better, and we'll change the color to something bright. You can see that the border is only showing on one half of the ring. It's not showing up on the inner side. So what we're going to do to fix this is mirror our bars before we turn on the pi shape. And to do that, we're actually going to use the mirror effect. So Effect, Distort, and down to Mirror, which is just off the screen. And we're going to drag this up after the border because we want to mirror that border as well. If we put it before, the border would be added afterwards. If we put it after, then it's going to include the border in that mirror. So let's just get some base values put down. Let's drag the reflection center right down here to around the middle of our current ring size. And let's change this reflection angle. And we want it to be exactly -90. And you can see here now that we've mirrored our layer, and now we have a border on the top and the bottom. So if we turn this pi effect back on, you can see that we're getting exactly what we want, which is now we have a border on both ends. So let's use an expression to set this up, because the issue now is that if we go and we turn off the pi graph, we still have this same whole reflection deal set up. So it's not going to work out. So we need a way to turn on and off this effect. Now, if the reflection angle is set to 0 and the linear wipe is turned off, then that's basically the same as having the effects not be applied at all. So those are the two things that we're going to have to do when we turn on and off the pi shape. So let's start with the linear wipe. We'll go into its expression, and we're going to pick whip the graph type control again. Copy this. We'll go in here. And we want to say if the graph type is set to ring, which has an index of 3, then we want it to be set to 85%. Otherwise, we want it to be set to 0. So we can copy this and paste it into the transition completion. And so now you can see that we have ring graph selected. The linear wipe has taken place. If we change it back to pi, then that goes away. And now the only reason it's not being turned into a pi graph is because we still have the pi effect turned off. But that's the effect we want. Now we also want the mirror effect to come on and off when the ring graph is selected. So we know that a value of -90 works for us, and we know that the transition completion on the linear wipe is always going to be set to 85%. Now, while I'm noticing it, let's change this name as well. We'll just call this ring shape. And we'll change the mirror to SG ring style. So we know that the value we have right here is going to work for us. And it's just about 90%, maybe even 95% of the way down the layer. So let's use that in our expression. So we'll go into the reflection center, and we can set the X value to just be the width of the layer. So let's once again copy this and we'll go into our notepad. So this layer dot width by this layer dot height, and we said it's about 90% of the way down the layer, so we're going to multiply this by 0.9. So that's the expression, and we'll paste that right in here, and you can see that now we have that set. Then all we have to do is set the expression for the reflection angle, which is a very simple if statement like usual. We'll just pick whip our control, get this again, and we're going to say if the value of our graph type is set to 3, then we want it to be set to -90. Otherwise, it's going to be set to 0. So this is our expression. And as we've been doing, we'll paste it right into the reflection angle. And so now let's test what we've got. We've had it set to ring graph, and we're getting the result we want. If we set it to pi graph, the size of the bars goes back to normal, and we only have the border on one end. So let's turn back on the pi effect, and then we can give it a real test. There we go, we get exactly the result we want. And now if we turn on the gradient's now a little bit smoother. Now unfortunately right now our gradient, you can see it's sort of washing everything out. So let's play around with this a little bit. And let's actually swap the colors. And now you can see that that gives us a little bit nicer of a look. And you can see that because of that mirror that we did, it sort of fades up and then fades back down. And if we go from ring graph to pi graph, you can see now that we get this little dome effect on top of our graph. So that looks a little bit better. Let's turn off gradient, turn off border for now. And we're actually almost done. All we have left now is to work with our third option, which is the bar graph. Now, there's two things that we want to do. One is when we go to bar graph, I actually want to have it scale itself down so that it doesn't match the edges of our composition. We want to give it a little bit of room inside. And the way I'm going to do that is using the transform effect. So let's go to effect, distort, and down to transform. And this is at the bottom where we want it. And we'll put SG, and this is just for the bar graph. So SG and then bar. And the only thing that we have to work with here is the scale option. We're going to turn off uniform scale, and we're going to put some if statements into both of these values. So we're going to actually use this same expression that's already written in here. We'll just delete what we have inside the if statement. And in this case, instead of if it's equal to 3, we want it to be if it's equal to 2, which is our selection of the bar graph. And if it is equal to 2, then we want our height to be 50% of what it is. Otherwise, we want to leave it at its normal value, which is 100%. So that'll be the expression for our height. You can see it shrunk that down a little bit. And the value for our width is going to be 90%. So you can see now our bar graph no longer reaches the edges of the composition. It's sort of shrunk down within the layer. And if we go and we change these, you can see that the pie graph and the ring graph still show up normally, but the bar graph turns on that transform effect and shrinks it down within the layer. Now, what's going to make this difficult is the border option. So let's go back in here and let's turn our border back on. Now you can see that we have the border at the bottom, but there's no border on the left and right, and there's no border along the top. And what this means is we have to go back in to our border and write a slightly different expression from what we have to accommodate when the bar graph option is chosen. We'll scroll up to find the border, and I just noticed that this is spelled wrong. Change that real quick. So here we have the border, and we want to actually change the expressions for both the anchor point and the height. So let's go into the anchor point first, and we'll select all this and copy it, paste it back into our notepad. And so you can see what we have here is the anchor point is just being set to a constant value. This is actually going to have to change when we are using the bar graph. So let's start by pick whipping our control up here so we can get this value. And we're going to say if this value is 2, which is our bar graph, then we're going to do one thing. Otherwise, we'll keep it at this same constant value, because this works for our ring graph and our pie graph. But if it's the bar graph, then we want to do something a little bit different. We actually want to bring the anchor point down so that we can see that bar at the top and the bottom. So we want to change the second value from -5 to something that's related to our border width. So to do that, I'm also going to come over here and get us the value of our border width. And we'll be using that in here also. You can see by default it wrote this little expression, but all we need is this. And I'm going to write set width, and this is the width that we've set in our control. And so now we have that value. So we're actually going to set the y value from -5, and we're going to set that equal to our set width value. So let's copy this expression and let's paste it into our anchor point. And so right off the bat, you can see that we've gotten a small amount of border on both sides. And as I increase this, you can see we're getting this increased size. But what we're still missing is the border on the right and left side. And the way we're going to deal with that is by duplicating our border. So the first thing we're going to change is the anchor point. And you can see that right now the anchor point's way out here, but our bar graph is actually shrunk down, and that's because of the transform effect. So let's turn that off just while we're writing this expression, just so that these points make a little bit more sense. So let's go into this border 2 and into the anchor point expression. And let's edit this a little bit. Now that's actually the same expression that we already had in here. We can actually get rid of the second half of the if statement because we only want this vertical border to be happening when the value is set to 2, when the graph type is set to bar. Otherwise, we're not going to worry about it. We're going to have to turn it off using another expression. So we want our anchor point to be in almost the same place. We actually want it to be inwards instead of outwards so that we can see that vertical line. And we also want to shift it up so that the vertical line takes up the entire height of the composition. So let's make those two changes. Let's just take away the +50. And we'll set the y to -50. So let's copy this in and see what it gives us. And you can see we've now shifted it up, and it's completely even with the right side of the composition, which is fine for right now. We'll be working with that. So let's work with the height real quick. We want the height to now be the full length of the composition. So we'll change this value, Alt-click to bring up its expression, and we're going to say it's equal to this layer dot height plus 100, which is exactly the opposite of our border 1's width value. So we've got that, and now we want to affect the width. Now the width is going to have to correspond to both the width of our control, and it's also going to have to control the anchor point, because we want it to be, as the width shrinks, our anchor point moves in. So let's bring up our expression for the border 1's height, and we're going to base our width expression off of that. So let's copy this, and we're going to paste it in below. So in our height from the border 1, we had a base of 865. Let's find out what a good base is for our width. Let's turn off the expression for now and bring our width down until it comes in a little bit. So we know that the width of our composition is 1920, which means that anything that's less than 1920 is going to show up in our composition. Now, something else that we have to remember is that right now we're only seeing the border on the left side. And once we bring that anchor point over, this value is going to be split between both sides. So anything we see is actually going to be cut in half. So if we look at something like 1820, it looks thick here, but once that's split, that should be pretty good. So let's say that 1820 is our midway point. So let's do the same sort of math we did before. When we have a value of 50, we want the value to be 1820. When we have a value of 0, we want it to be 1920. And that means that when we have a value of 100, we want it to be 1720. Now what this means is that the difference between the highest and the lowest is going to be 200 rather than 220 as it was before. And this means that every 1% is going to be equal to 2 pixels rather than 2.2. So changing this from 2.2 to 2. Add height, this makes more sense now if we write add width. And I'd put 1820 here, but this is actually supposed to be 1720 to match our highest point rather than our midway point. And so now let's see if this works out when we place it into our expression. So now you can see that our width value is set correctly based on the width for the border that we set up here. And as we increase it, you can see that the border is increasing not only top and bottom, but also left to right. The problem is that we still don't have the border on the right side over here. So let's work with this top expression up here. And what we want to do is split it so that half of this border stays on the left side and the other half is visible on the right side. So to do that, we're going to start by taking a look at what we have this width value set to. So let's get that value, and we'll just pick whip the width, and we'll copy the portion that we need, and we'll paste this in here. And this is actually going to be another set width, so we'll say set width 2 is equal to this value. So what we want to do is split what we had, split that border in half, so half of it can go on the left and half of it can go on the right. Now to know how wide that border is, we have to subtract the width value from the total width of the composition. So to do that, we're going to say total border width is equal to this layer dot width minus set width 2. This will give us the width of that border on the left side, and then to get half of that, we'll divide by 2, which will allow us to evenly split it between each side. And we'll say shift amount is equal to total border width divided by 2. And then if we just subtract that shift amount from the anchor point, then we should get our shifting done correctly. So let's copy this whole expression, paste it into this anchor point, and there you can see that now we have a perfectly even border on both sides. And now, as we change the border width, you can see we're now getting an even scaling border on all 4 sides. So now you can see we're good here, but the issue is that when we change from bar graph to pie graph something else, we get this error. And the reason for that is because we have this if statement, and when the if statement's not true, we're not putting out any value. So we have to add just a little bit to this if statement and say else, and then we'll just give it a value of 0. So 0, comma 0. And now we should be good. Now you can see that we don't get any errors, but we also don't get the correct outcome. So we're going to change it so that now it turns off if it's not set to that second value. So we're going to do that by going into the opacity. And instead of saying if the border is equal true, we're going to copy the if statement from over here. And we want it to be if the graph type is set to 2, which is our bar graph, then we can see this border. Otherwise, it's going to be set to 0. So you can see when we turn that on, there was no change. But now if we go to the pie graph, we don't see that weird vertical border effect that was going on before. And if we change this width down to our normal amount of 50, and we switch back and forth between our ring graph, our pie graph, and our bar graph, you can see that all of these borders are now working as they're supposed to, depending on the type of graph. So now there's only one thing left that we have to do for our border to be complete. And if we go back into the notepad, we can see that right now we have our base value set to 1720. And we also set an explicit base value for the regular border. And the problem with that is the same as what we discussed earlier, where this will work when the composition or the layer size is 1920 by 1080. But if the layer size is anything other than that, this value might not work right. So let's change our values and make them dynamic so that it will work correctly no matter what size the layer is. So let's go back into our notepad, and we'll just start with the border 2 just because we already have that expression up. And let's start by finding a new base value. So we know that our current composition width is 1920, and we know that we like the base value of 1720. So if we divide 1720 by 1920, we get something right around 0.896. So rather than saying 1720 here, I'm going to change it to this layer dot width times 0.896. And so currently this will give us that same, or right around the same, 1720 as our base. So that will work for that. And then we just need to change this times 2. So what that was before was 1920 minus 1720 is 200, and that divided by 100 got us 2. So we're going to do the same thing. And we're just going to say this layer dot width minus our base, which is basically the same as saying 1920 minus 1720 in this case. And then we're going to add another set of parentheses. And right in here, I'm going to write divided by 100. So this should give us exactly the same as what we had before, but now everything is completely dynamic. So let's copy this. And we'll go back into our width expression, and we'll replace what we have here with our new expression. And this number should stay right around the same as what it is now. And you can see it only went up by 1/10, so that will work for us. So then we have to do this for our first border. So we're going to go into here, we'll go down to the height in this case, copy all of this, and I'll just paste it in here below. And so let's go through the same process. In this case, we're talking about the height, which is 1080 for the layer. And we like our value of 865. And when you divide 865 by 1080, you get something right around 0.801. So let's put this into our expression. We'll start with the base, and instead of 865, we're going to say this layer dot height. And we'll multiply that by 0.801. And then we also have to come down and change 2.2. And I'll just make double parentheses for right now, since I know we're going to add those. And we're going to put in this layer dot height minus the base. And we'll divide that by 100 again. So let's copy this expression. Bring it in. Paste it into our border height. And once again, you can see that everything remained the same as it was. So now we have a working border that's also going to be dynamic and apply the same look no matter what size the layer is. So the last thing we have to do is turn back on the bar option. And you can see now that we get this bar graph with its own custom border. And as we scroll back up, we can go through everything now just to double check and make sure it's all working. Turn on random colors. Turn on the gradient, change the blend mode. And you can see now that everything is working as we've planned it. And best of all, if we hit that reset button, because we've created our own custom control that has all of our defaults set for us, we go immediately back to our default values and everything is reset for us. So I know this has been an extremely long tutorial. I hope that you picked up something even if you didn't watch the entire thing, but that's how you can create your own complex custom preset and get it all to work in After Effects. Now, let's just save this out as the last step. We'll select everything in here, and we're just going to click and drag it into the Effects and Presets section. And a window will pop up where we can type in the name of our preset, which is just Simple Graphs. And I already have it, so I'm going to call this Simple Graphs 2. And now our preset's saved. So if we go in here and we search Simple Graphs, we can see down here Simple Graphs 2. And just to show you that it's all working, we'll go to New Composition, create a new solid, and we're going to drag this on. And right away you can see that our control is here, and all of our expressions have all been saved and applied to this new layer. So now you've seen how you can create a complex preset for After Effects. In the next tutorial, we're going to go back into the Pseudo Effects suite and see how you can create that pseudo file and get it all ready to send out to your users so that they can install it with the Pseudo Effect installer. So I'll see you in the next tutorial.